Converted Man here. Alright, let's look at the video that Armored Apologist did. Bad arguments against the soul. I personally would like to see a good argument for it before we get into how we can potentially knock down bad arguments for it. Here's a few that he's picked to look at in this video, and I've heard these arguments before. I've seen and heard better ones, but nonetheless, these are pretty decent arguments, if not put in syllogism for. So he appeals to analogy, and in this case it's a false analogy. If you spin that wheel fast enough, that color didn't emerge, it just looked like it emerged. So if you spin a blue and yellow wheel, it kind of looks green or kind of looks yellow depending on whether or not you have color vision or not and how fast you're spinning it. So no, the two aren't identical, and they never were. Your mind is processing the spinning wheel as a single color. So this analogy doesn't work. It's just that simple. Okay, so there's really not anything more to say here other than this analogy is false, and because it's a false analogy, none of these arguments work anymore. So, bad try at trying to show how this argument was bad. Correlation is not the same as identity. I guess this is trying to go for correlation causation sort of argumentation, that how does this apply to the brain, though? That's the problem I have with that analogy. So he's going to walk us through an analogy to letters and a story, and how these things, when they're put into words, make a story. That the meaning of the story is more than just the component parts. Yes, it is. Of course, it requires your brain to know letters and know the words and know the meaning of the words and know the language of those words to be able to do anything with this. I think using language to try to explain how thoughts are more than just part of our brain isn't going to work for two reasons. One, you need a brain to understand language, and the way that the brain understands language is a very complex process. So the analogy relies upon the very thing that it's trying to be an analogy of, which is the brain. So typically analogies are trying to make things simpler for people to understand, not more complicated. And the other reason this fails is that if you don't have the letters, then you don't have a story, and thus you don't have any further meaning. So if you're saying that the blips on a screen of, say, an EKG, when you look at the brain producing various electromagnetic fields on a CAT scan or EKG or whatever it is, if you're saying that that is the meaning of the story is more than just those letters, if the blips are the letters, well, without the blips, without the letters, there is no story and there is no meaning. So using your own analogy, it still means that without the blips on the screen, there is no story going on. So there's nothing going on. If you didn't have the language, you didn't have the letters, you didn't have a written down story, you can't have a story to have any meaning, and if you have no meaning, then what are you left with? Your analogy just completely implodes on itself there. This analogy is just fallacious because it assumes the duality that it's trying to argue for. A computer and the software is dependent upon the software of a computer is dependent upon the hardware, whereas our thoughts are dependent upon our brain. So if you're trying to say that we're more than the sum of our parts, saying that it's like a computer doesn't get you any further. The only thing that you seem to do is try to split consciousness away from your hardware, which is your brain is the hardware, and your consciousness is the software. Okay, but if you corrupt the hardware, the software can't function anyways. So again, using the same analogy, you can still get to the same conclusion that there is no duality here. I think that trying to compare our brain to a computer is a very weak analogy and ultimately self-defeating, because if you delete data, there is nothing left at all. And if you damage the computer, then no software will run. So, yeah. Okay, so if you damage the software but you didn't damage the hardware, it's still okay. Yeah, that's great for the computer. But if you damage the software of a human and their hardware, which is their brain, is not damaged, or you're seeing that the brain itself is the software and the hardware is somewhere else, which just begs the question. So I'm not going to stop using them. I wouldn't use these ones, by the way. I would use different ones. The ones and now we're done with his video, so the ones I would look at would be where we are making great strides in understanding brain functions more and more like they were just electrical signals. These researchers recently were able to have two people's brains being scanned, and the one person could think, and when they thought, move hand or press this button, this person that was in another building would move their hand and press this button. So that's pretty awesome. If there is more to this than just electrical signals, then how can software interact with each other in this way unless we're built to be compatible like computers or something, right? Of course, those that believe in spooky stuff might see this as, well, this proves that our mind is more than just our mind because we're able to do this, I guess. What it proves is that our brain is very mechanical in nature. There's also a case of a conjoined twin attached by their heads to each other, and this particular conjoined twin, one can feel the pain of the other one. So more humanitarian experiments would be needed before we can deduce anything more. The suggestion was that we don't feed one for a while, so that but we feed the one conjoined, but not the other one. So we see if she picks up her sister's hunger. So that's a humanitarian experiment because you're not really hurting them. But again, if their brains are linked together, they would die if you unlinked their brains. They're dead. That's it. And I think other studies that would cause a problem here with this idea of duality is the case where hemispheres are split in half. And we had a case, or is it not we, but there was a case where somebody's hemispheres were split in half, and one hemisphere believed in God and the other hemisphere didn't. So does that mean one hemisphere is going to heaven and the other one's going to hell? I think that again and again, duality has been demolished by our scientific understanding of how the brain really works. Duality relies upon appeals to ignorance and relies upon appeals to analogy. I have yet to see a syllogism arguing for duality, but there might be one out there. I just haven't seen it myself. So if Armored Apologist can find one, he can send it to me and I can tell him how wrong it is, and I can make a video about that. There's nothing here to say. I can't even count the logical fallacies because it's nothing more than appeals to analogies. So, you know, however many analogies he had, like, what, 5, 6? That's how many logical fallacies he had. None of them were good analogies, so they're fallacious analogies, so we've got nothing. Let's go back to the computer one, because I made a similar argument once upon a time, and I'm going to actually debunk myself here in an upcoming video. Talk about a video that I made when I was a Christian and tell how wrong it is and why it's wrong, and count the logical fallacies while I'm at it. But I made a similar argument, so I understand where he's coming from, but it's wrong. If we go with the computer analogy, here's the thing. Software can be programmed to detect the hardware and interfere with the hardware. You can write code. In BASIC, it would be pokes. I don't know what it would be in other languages, but there is code that you can write that will harm the hardware from the software side. You can overheat the fan. You can do different things with the monitor. You can harm the hardware if you know how to program it right. Now, older computers are more vulnerable to those sort of programs than the newer ones are, but still, if you know your computer stuff well enough, you could have software built to harm the hardware. And you can also have software built to detect the hardware. Do you have a CD drive? Yes, I do. Open CD drive. CD drive opens and closes. So where is the human ability to open my CD drive? I can move my physical body, but if I'm more than just that, then shouldn't I be able to do more than just physical things? I don't know. How would that work? How would I know? So there would be some way to test to see if this was real. There would be some way to verify that it was real, other than just analogies, other than just arguments. But I would love to see, if you can't produce the empirical evidence, and I don't think you could, some test, but I don't think you could produce that either. So, since you can't do either of those, produce the logically coherent argument. You don't have it here. Maybe you know of a syllogism. I can analyze the syllogism for logical fallacies. If you find a syllogism that's logically coherent for dualism, which is what you're trying to argue for here, then I'll be on board with this. If not, then not. And unless and until we have a logically coherent argument, we have to continue to be skeptical of the conclusions.